It didn't begin in Rome. It didn't begin in a church. And it certainly didn't begin with power. The first Christians gathered in places no one noticed, caves carved into cliffsides marketplaces, after dusk, the back rooms of modest homes, hidden between crumbling walls. They whispered their beliefs to one another, like secrets too precious to shout. Because in their world, truth was dangerous, and faith even more so. Long before Christianity was a cathedral, it was a conversation, a mystery, a spark passed from hand to trembling hand. This story isn't about the religion you know. It's about the one that almost disappeared. They called themselves seekers of gnosis knowledge. Not knowledge from books or kings, but inner knowledge. The kind that didn't need permission from emperors. The kind that couldn't be chained in stone. The Gnostics believed the divine wasn't far away, it was within. Inside you, inside me, buried beneath the noise of the world. And to find it, you had to wake up. But waking up came at a price. The Roman Empire tolerated many gods as long as they bowed to the emperor. But these early Christians didn't. They didn't light incense for Caesar. They didn't join the feasts. They said quietly but clearly, "This world isn't the real one." And that terrified those in power. The early followers of Christ didn't carry crosses. They didn't wear icons. What they carried were stories passed in the dark, written in code, buried in jars. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas. Names you weren't supposed to hear. Because these Gospels didn't show Jesus as just a teacher. They painted him as a revealer, a guide to awakening. In one text, Jesus laughs, not out of cruelty, but clarity. He knows the world is asleep. He knows they will kill him for trying to wake it. And they did. But the story didn't end at the cross. It went underground. You won't find this version of Christianity in many churches. You'll find it in dust and fragments, in libraries that once locked them away. And yet these forbidden voices still call out. From Nag Hammadi, from Egypt's dry soil, from whispers in forgotten catacombs. Not all Christians believed the same. Some thought the world was broken by accident. Others believed it was a trap. Some followed a savior who bled. Others followed one who simply remembered. This diversity was dangerous. And the church that would later rise, armored in orthodoxy and empire, needed unity. So it erased the rest. Burned scrolls, buried names, branded thinkers as heretics. But not before they left traces. And that's what we're following now, the traces. Because history doesn't begin with winners. It begins with what the winners tried to hide. In the parts ahead, we will unearth those lost gospels. We will meet the women who taught the mystics, who dared to speak, the emperors who silenced them, and the monks who preserved their memory in the shadows. This isn't just the story of Gnosticism. It's the story of a war between inner truth and outer control, between silence and awakening, between exile and revelation. And it all begins in a whisper. The desert doesn't speak in words, it speaks in secrets. In 1945, just outside the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer digging for fertilizer hit something hard. Not treasure, not stone, but a clay jar sealed for nearly 2,000 years. Inside it, 13 leather-bound books. Not books, really codices. Not chapters, but revelations. And when scholars finally began to read them, the world trembled. These were the Gnostic Gospels. For centuries, we thought we knew the story: 4 Gospels, one Savior, one path. But buried under sand and silence was another voice, a chorus of voices. And they told a very different story. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus doesn't perform miracles. He doesn't walk on water. Instead, he whispers riddles, truths that crack the shell of reality. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. These weren't instructions for worship. They were invitations for awakening. The early Gnostics didn't see Jesus as a god to be worshipped from afar. They saw him as a mirror reflecting the divine buried in themselves. This was dangerous, because once you believe God lives in you, you stop bowing to those who claim to speak for him. The Gospel of Mary goes further. It presents Mary Magdalene, not Peter, as the disciple who truly understood Jesus. In its pages, the other apostles grow jealous. They doubt her. But Mary speaks calmly clearly. What is hidden from you, I will proclaim. A woman, revealing what the men cannot bear to hear. No wonder the church tried to erase her. And then the Gospel of Judas, shocking, confusing, explosive. In it, Judas doesn't betray Jesus. He fulfills his request. He sets the plan in motion not out of greed, but out of trust. In this version, Jesus laughs again because he sees beyond betrayal, beyond suffering. He sees the dream waking up. Why were these Gospels hidden? Because they shattered the control of the orthodox story. Because they opened too many doors. The early church faced a choice: unity or mystery. It chose unity. It built walls. It locked the doors. And it told the world, only these four. Only these men. Only this version. Everything else was heresy. Even if it was written by apostles. Even if it carried the same name, gospel. So the forbidden texts were burned, their readers exiled, their teachers silenced. But a few monks, risking everything, buried the truth in jars. They fled to the edges of the empire. They scratched wisdom into cave walls. They taught in whispers, because they believed something sacred should not be silenced. Not even by the church, not even by time. To understand the first Christians, we must forget what we think we know. They were not one voice, one creed, one cross. They were a wildfire of questions, a movement of seekers, a dream that believed heaven wasn't up there but in here. And though the empires burned their books, the flame never died. Next, we will follow that flame across the Roman world to Alexandria's libraries, to Antioch's marketplaces, to the catacombs beneath the cities, where gospel and danger shared the same breath. Because every secret buried waits to be unearthed. There is a reason you've never heard some of these names. Valentinus, Basilides, Carpocrates. They were once teachers of the first Christians, brilliant, poetic, fierce in spirit. But their Gospels didn't make it into the book, not because they lacked truth, but because their truths threatened something deeper: control. Valentinus believed in a God beyond the God of the Bible, a God of pure light, unknowable, infinite, unreachable by hierarchy. In his vision, the universe was born from longing, a longing so deep it tore the heavens open and created us. To the empire and the rising church, this was chaos. It meant the world wasn't built on divine command, but divine rupture. The Gnostics spoke of aeons, emanations of divine mind. They described Sophia, wisdom, as a being who fell not out of sin, but compassion. And from her fall, the material world was born. What did this mean? It meant the world wasn't evil, but it wasn't the end. It meant we were sparks of light trapped in skin. And salvation wasn't obedience, it was remembrance. The Orthodox story told of a God who demanded faith. The Gnostic story spoke of a divine source who whispered, "Remember who you are." These weren't just theological ideas. They were spiritual revolutions. The Gnostics didn't need temples. They became temples. They didn't fear the emperor. They feared forgetting. They baptized not just with water, but with silence, rituals that echoed the journey inward. They used symbols, passwords, hidden knowledge. Not to exclude, but to awaken. To follow the Gnostic path was to turn away from the world's noise, to close your eyes and hear the voice beneath the voice. But the world does not reward quiet revelation. In the 2nd century, a new power was rising: orthodoxy. Churches began to organize, bishops gathered, councils formed, and a canon, the approved official books, was being shaped. The Gnostics didn't fit. They asked too many questions. They offered too many answers. So the church branded them dangerous. Rome branded them traitors. And between sword and scripture they were scattered. Some were killed, others recanted, most disappeared. But their words survived, in fragments, in rumors, in echoes that reached across centuries. When Constantine converted to Christianity, the church finally had a throne. With empire on its side, the lines were drawn sharper than ever. Only one gospel, only one church, only one way. Everything else was pushed into darkness. Everything else was renamed heresy. And yet those lost voices did not die. They lived in monasteries too remote to burn, in scrolls too old to care about, in hearts that remembered the old whisper, "You are not broken, you are asleep. Wake up." In Part 4, we descend deeper into the persecution, The execution, the quiet heroism of those who refused to forget. Into the flames, and the voices that still sang from them. To believe was to risk everything. In the shadow of Rome's glory, to carry a forbidden gospel was not an act of rebellion. It was a death sentence. The empire had no patience for divergent truth. And the rising church, now laced with imperial ambition, had no room for mystery. They came quietly at first, a knock in the night, a neighbor who no longer returned your greeting, a whispered name at the forum. Then came the raids. Scrolls were seized, homes ransacked, children questioned, women, teachers, mothers dragged from basements, and accused not of theft, but of insight. Imagine this. You hold in your hands a text copied by candlelight, your only copy. It tells you that God is within you. It tells you that death is an illusion, that salvation is remembrance. And now you are told, burn it, or be burned. Some complied, others couldn't. There are stories of believers swallowing parchment pieces so the words might never be captured, of scrolls buried in wells, of entire families walking into exile with nothing but verses memorized in their minds. These were not fanatics. They were dreamers. They were guardians of a truth too soft to survive in the empire's iron grip. Among them were women, many of them. The Gnostic communities welcomed their voices. Mary, Helena, Thecla, they taught, they led, they wrote. But in the world outside, their voices were dangerous. So history erased them, replaced their names with silence, turned their leadership into myth or, worse, scandal. But the voices didn't disappear. They became stories. They became questions. They became a quiet resistance that lived on in symbols, scratched on walls, in chants passed from mother to daughter, in names whispered only during storms. The persecution wasn't always fire and chains. Sometimes it was policy. Sometimes it was rewriting. Councils met. Votes were cast. And with each new decree, entire belief systems were exiled not by sword, but by silence. When the Council of Nicaea convened in 325 CE, the Church didn't just define doctrine. It defined memory. It chose the Gospels you now know. It rejected the rest. Not because they were false, but because they couldn't be controlled. The Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the thunder perfect mind. These were poems more than rules, riddles more than answers. And the empire needed order. So they became dust, or so they thought. Because even dust remembers. In a monastery in the Egyptian desert, a monk wrapped his forbidden codices in leather. He sealed them in a jar. He buried them, not to hide them from us, but to save them for us. That jar would not be opened for another 1,600 years. And yet the words inside it still breathe. Because truth, like spirit, doesn't die, it waits. In Part 5, we will follow the journey of those hidden texts, across borders, across centuries, and into the hands of those who would finally dare to read them again. The desert kept its secret well. For centuries beneath the hot sands of Egypt, a jar lay undisturbed. Inside a time capsule, a rebellion, a whisper buried alive. The man who found it in 1945 was no scholar. He was a farmer looking for fertilizer. But what he unearthed would shake theology to its core. 13 codices bound in leather, written in Coptic, preserved in silence. At first, no one understood their value. Some were sold on the black market. One was even used as kindling. But scholars eventually gathered the fragments, pieced them together, translated them, and what emerged was astonishing. The Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Mary. Voices that had been silenced, words that had been erased. Now suddenly they were speaking again. But they didn't speak in commands, they spoke in riddles. They didn't say believe, they said see. The kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. If you know yourselves, then you will be known. These weren't rules, they were mirrors. In the Gospel of Philip, marriage is not about law, but union of soul. In the Gospel of Mary, wisdom comes through inward silence, not external hierarchy. In the Apocryphon of John, the divine spark travels through layers of illusion to return home. These texts didn't deny Christ, they deepened him. But the question arose, why were these Gospels hidden? The answer was simple, because they were too free. They spoke of a path not owned by empire, of salvation not brokered by priests, of truth that did not need a gatekeeper. They shattered the monopoly. So they were buried, not out of shame, but hope. Hope that one day someone would be ready to read them. And now we are. In the modern era, these texts have been translated, studied, debated. Some fear them, others embrace them. Some churches still deny their value. Others see them as windows into the diversity, the beauty, the tension of early faith. Because the truth is, the first Christians didn't all agree. They didn't have one voice. They had a symphony. Orthodoxy was not born, it was built. And what it built, it often buried. But the buried does not always stay silent. These recovered texts challenge us to ask, what if the canon is not complete? What if the truth is larger than what survived? In reading the Lost Gospels, we do not lose faith. We expand it. We reclaim forgotten voices. We honor their questions. We listen again for that ancient whisper, "You are more than they told you." In Part 6, we will follow the struggle in modern times of scholars, believers, and skeptics wrestling with the implications of what was found. Because the past isn't over. It's waiting to be remembered. The past wasn't dead. It was reawakened. When the Nag Hammadi codices entered the modern world, they did more than rewrite footnotes in theology textbooks. They disturbed the silence. They reopened questions many thought were settled. For the church, especially those who had built centuries of doctrine upon a fixed canon, this was dangerous. How do you handle a gospel that calls Mary Magdalene the true interpreter of Christ? How do you explain texts that present salvation as self-knowledge rather than obedience? The answers didn't come easily, and many didn't want to answer at all. Some religious institutions dismissed the Gnostic texts, outright calling them heretical, fantastical fringe. They said these were rejected for a reason. They are distortions, late inventions. But were they? Carbon dating, linguistic analysis, and historical context revealed many of these texts were as old or older than the canonical Gospels. Their voices came from the same ancient well. They just offered a different reflection. Others took a different path. Scholars like Elaine Pagels, Marvin Meyer, and Karen King dared to ask, what if Christianity was never meant to be one story? What if it was meant to be many? Their work brought light to forgotten figures, to women who taught, to mystics who questioned, to teachers who believed faith was a journey inward, not a creed imposed from above. And for many readers, the lost Gospels weren't threats. They were invitations. They felt more human, more intimate. Jesus wasn't a remote deity. They said he was a guide, not a judge, a revealer. And that idea changed people. Modern seekers, especially those disillusioned with institutional religion, began turning to the Gnostic texts not as replacements, but as supplements. They searched not for rules, but resonance, not for commandments, but connections. In silent rooms they read, "If you bring forth what is within you, it will save you." And something stirred. Still, opposition remained. Even today, some accuse the Gnostic revival of being spiritual relativism, of undermining the authority of tradition, of confusing seekers instead of guiding them. But history itself is not neat. It is wild, contradictory, unfinished. And in that mess, beauty often lives. Museums now display the Nag Hammadi texts under glass. Professors teach them in classrooms. Spiritual retreats explore their poetry. Artists paint visions of Sophia. Mystics meditate on thunderous riddles. And across the world, people begin to realize the first Christians were not one tribe. They were many. Not one path, but a wilderness of wonder. In their Gospels, there are no easy answers. But there are doorways. Doorways into self, into silence, into questions that refuse to be buried. And that is perhaps the most sacred thing of all, not certainty, but the courage to ask again. In Part 7, we will explore the spiritual heart of Gnosticism, their cosmology, their symbols, their strange and beautiful vision of the divine. Because to understand their gospel, we must learn to see as they saw, not with eyes, but with inner light. To understand the Gnostics, we must set aside the map. They didn't walk straight roads. They wandered through symbols. They searched in silence. They saw the divine not as a throne in the clouds, but as a mystery unfolding within. Their cosmology wasn't simple. It was a myth of the soul's journey. At the center, the pleroma, not a place, but a fullness, a realm of pure light, of being beyond being. From it emanated aeons, divine aspects, male and female dancing in perfect harmony. They were not gods. They were reflections like facets of a jewel of the unknowable source. Among them was Sophia, wisdom. She longed to know the One. She reached too far and fell, and in her fall the material world was born. But not as punishment, as a consequence of yearning. The Gnostics believed we were children of that fall, fragments of light trapped in flesh. And so the world we see is not the true world. It is a veil, the ruler of this world, not the source, but the demiurge, a blind god, a craftsman. Ignorant, proud, convinced, he was the only power. Some called him Yaldabaoth. He created matter not out of malice but ignorance, and he gave us laws, punishments, illusions. He said, I am God. There is no other. But the Gnostics smiled, because they remembered Sophia, and through her they remembered the light. The journey of the soul then is not to appease the demiurge. It is to awaken from his dream. This awakening gnosis is not belief. It is direct knowing. It is the soul remembering its origin, its true name. Gnosis comes not from rituals but from inner revelation, a crack in the illusion, a whisper in silence, a sudden recognition that you are more than dust. This is why the Gnostic texts speak in riddles, why they frustrate scholars, why they seem to contradict. They are not instruction manuals. They are mirrors. They are firelight flickering in a cave, hinting at the shape of something greater. Gnostics use symbols, the pearl hidden in the mud, the bridegroom seeking his beloved, the spark rising from the ash. They used sacred geometry, chants, initiations, not to belong to a club, but to unlock something inside. They saw the cross not as a symbol of sacrifice, but of transformation. They saw Jesus not as a blood offering, but as a revealer, a bringer of memory. He didn't die to change God's mind about us. He came to change our mind about ourselves. Split the wood, I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me. He lived so we could remember the divine within. This was the Gnostic vision, not one of damnation, but of amnesia, not of wrath, but of forgetfulness. And redemption then was not a transaction, it was a waking up. In Part 8, we step into the hidden legacy of Gnosticism, how it echoed through centuries of mystics, heretics, artists, and seekers, long after it was thought dead. Because an idea born in silence never truly disappears. You can silence a voice, but not an idea. Though the Gnostics were hunted, burned, and buried, their spark never went out. It flickered quietly beneath the surface of history, waiting, breathing. In the mountains of southern France, the Cathars whispered echoes of Gnostic truth. They spoke of two worlds, one of light, one of darkness. They rejected power, wealth, and dogma. They lived in simplicity. They called themselves the pure. The Church called them heretics. And in the 13th century, it launched a crusade, not against infidels, but against fellow Christians. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. Entire towns burned. The last Cathar stronghold, Montségur, fell in 1244. But their light did not die there. In medieval monasteries, monks secretly copied strange texts, books that did not belong in the canon. Some hid them in walls. Others translated them into codes and allegories. And through the Renaissance, mystics and alchemists rediscovered fragments of Gnostic insight. They spoke of hidden knowledge, of divine spark, of inner transformation. Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in 1600, believed the universe was infinite, and divinity lived in all things. Jacob Boehme, a shoemaker turned mystic, saw creation as a fall into separation and a return to unity. These were not Gnostics in name, but their spirit-burning, questioning luminous was the same. Even in art, the current ran deep. William Blake painted visions of angels, gods, and a demiurge-like figure shaping the world with cold compasses. Jung explored the lost gospels, dreaming of archetypes and the collective unconscious. He called the Gnostic texts a psychological treasure, because that's what they had become. Not just theology, but therapy for the soul. In the 20th century, when the Nag Hammadi library was finally translated and published, something astonishing happened. Ordinary readers felt seen, not judged, not preached to, but understood. They found in these pages a truth not bound to church walls, a truth that said, "You are more than they told you. Your soul is ancient. Your longing is not a sin, it's a signal." The Gnostic legacy became a thread woven into spiritual awakenings across time. In New Age thought, in modern mysticism, in silent retreats and whispered prayers, in the longing that so many carry but few know how to name. Because we are all in some way exiles, and the Gnostics were exiles of the spirit. Their faith was not in dogma but in memory, not in obedience but in awakening. And their question is still our question. What if you were never lost, only sleeping? In Part 9, we reach the climax, uncovering how Gnostic thought lives on today, and what it means for a world still wrestling with the balance between control and freedom belief, and knowing silence and revelation. The world changed, but the questions remained. In a time of algorithms and instant answers, something ancient is rising again. Not in temples, not in pulpits, but in hearts. Gnostic thought, once burned and buried, now glows softly in unexpected places. In podcasts exploring mysticism, in books that blend science and spirit, in communities that gather not to be told but to listen together. We live in an age of spiritual fatigue, of hunger wrapped in doubt, of longing cloaked in irony. People leave churches, not because they hate faith, but because they seek something deeper than certainty. They want experience, not instruction. And the Gnostic voice whispers to them, "The truth is already within you. You are not broken. You have simply forgotten." Modern seekers are drawn to this, not because it flatters them, but because it honors their complexity. In therapy rooms, ancient wounds are unearthed. In yoga studios, people breathe into silence. In quiet corners of the internet, readers share lines from Thomas Mary Phillip. It's not a movement, it's a murmur, a rediscovery. Not of new answers, but of old, silenced questions. And for some, this is dangerous. Because Gnosis doesn't bow. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't fit into systems. It says, look within. The kingdom is not coming. It is already here. Some institutions push back. They warn of heresy, of chaos, of relativism. But those who have tasted this inner light are not trying to destroy tradition. They are trying to breathe again. They see Jesus not as exclusive, but as expansive. They see salvation not as a rescue, but as a remembrance. They do not abandon community. They redefine it. Not as obedience to hierarchy, but as sacred connection. In coffee shops and retreat centers and message boards and late-night talks, a quiet revolution is blooming. Not loud, not proud, but patient, persistent. Because what was once forbidden is now being read again. What was once exiled is now being reclaimed. And the question that began in dusty scrolls and whispered rituals now echoes across time. What is real? Who am I? Where did I come from? And maybe, just maybe, those aren't questions to be answered, but lived. In Part 10, we will conclude this journey, tracing the ultimate legacy of the Gnostics and what their story might mean for all of us who are still searching in the silence. What remains after all the fire has passed? After the texts were buried, burned, banned. After the names were smeared, the voices silenced. What is left? A whisper, a glow, a seed. Gnosticism, for all its complexity and poetry, offers something heartbreakingly simple. You are divine. You have forgotten. You can remember. That remembering is not given, it is earned. Not preached, it is awakened. Not taught, but revealed. And no institution can own it. No doctrine can lock it down. Because it lives where nothing else can reach, inside you. For 2,000 years, this idea survived, not because it was powerful, but because it was true for someone. And that someone passed it on, whispered, copied, dreamed. And so we arrive here. In a world obsessed with noise, the Gnostics teach us to honor silence. In a world that rewards obedience, they remind us of inner sovereignty. In a world eager for saviors, they remind us we are not lost, only asleep. This journey has not been about agreeing with every Gnostic word. It has been about listening. Listening to the exiled, the erased, the strange and sacred possibilities that once burned in hearts long gone. The forbidden books once read, do not simply inform. They transform. Because when you hear ancient words say, "The kingdom is within you," you feel something unlock. It's not certainty. It's not comfort. It's something wilder. Hope, not the kind sold from pulpits, but the kind that grows in ruins. You begin to wonder, what if the answers aren't outside? What if no priest or prophet is needed? What if all the maps we inherited were drawn for other roads? And what if? That's okay, because maybe faith is not a fortress. Maybe it's a fire. And maybe the Gnostics weren't trying to build a new religion. Maybe they were trying to keep the flame alive. They failed, some would say. But look around you. Their words are being read again. Their symbols painted anew. Their questions reborn in different tongues, different eyes, different longings. That is not failure. That is resurrection. And now it's your turn. Not to believe, but to ask. Not to follow, but to seek. Not to be told, but to remember. Split the wood. I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me. You have always carried the light. Now you see it. The secret history of the first Christians was never just history. It was a mirror. And now you've looked into it. What you do next is up to you.